Hello and welcome to this throwback episode of Our Fake History. While the podcast is on a very brief summer break, I am revisiting some of my favorite episodes from past seasons. Last week, I threw you back to episode number 116, What Went Down on Easter Island, Part 1. And today, we are checking out What Went Down on Easter Island, Part 2. Now, as the name suggests, this is part 2 in a 2-part series. So if you didn't catch part 1, you might want to scroll back in the feed and give that a listen now. This series originally aired at the start of season 6, which was in September of 2020. So this was a peak pandemic era release. When I make these episodes, I never know how they're going to land. I found that this was one of those series that inspired listeners to reach out. Now, many of those folks who sent me emails were Polynesians, and this remains one of the true joys of podcasting. You can make something in your bedroom in Canada, and it can somehow connect with someone living on a Pacific island. Now, at the risk of sounding too maudlin, I think that was the original dream of the internet, right? A new level of international connectivity. Where did we go wrong? Anyway, I received many messages from Hawaiians, Samoans, and many from the good people of Aotearoa, aka New Zealand. It meant a lot to hear that many of these listeners felt well served by these episodes. The whole point of this series was to clear up a number of pervasive misconceptions about both the island of Rapa Nui, aka Easter Island, and Polynesian history more generally. So it felt really nice to know that people with Polynesian ancestry found the show and appreciated my conclusions. As I mentioned in last week's introduction, I also learned quite a lot from the Polynesian folks who sent me emails and messaged me through various forms of social media. So let me say this again. If you ever want to get in touch with me, send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. I love hearing from the listeners. You can also find me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Blue Sky. I'm all over the place. Now, as you will hear on today's throwback episode, I take on the hypothesis promoted by the pop geographer Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, that the people of Rapa Nui were the authors of a civilizational collapse after they carelessly deforested their island. I propose that part of the reason that Diamond's take on Rapa Nui gained so much traction was because it seemed like such a clear allegory for our own global ecological crisis. In Jared Diamond's analogy, we are all the people of Rapa Nui, foolishly cutting down the last trees in service of bigger and better status symbols. As you will hear, I am very critical of Diamond's take, and I spend most of this episode demonstrating that the best research on Rapa Nui undercuts his grand narrative about the island. Now, one thing that I did not say on this episode, and that I would like to say now, is that just because Jared Diamond was wrong about Rapa Nui, that does not mean that we should not take our global ecological crisis seriously. In his book, Collapse, Jared Diamond tried to use historical examples of resource mismanagement to make the case that those of us living in the 21st century could be the authors of a civilization-ending environmental disaster if we do not heed the lessons of these fallen societies. The problem with Diamond's book is not his insistence that we should act in order to avoid the worst outcomes of global climate change. That is probably the best thing about his book. The problem is that his examples of historical ecocide are not great. His take on Rapa Nui is especially bad. Now, it could be easy for a climate change skeptic to look at Diamond's book and go, aha, I told you that climate change was a hoax. Diamond is pushing a narrative about climate change and is manipulating history to fit that narrative. So, let me be extremely clear about this. Diamond's book is not great, but that does not mean that climate change is not a threat that we need to take seriously. There's no doubt that we are feeling the effects of it more acutely every year. This might be the thing that frustrates me the most about collapse. Not only does it ignore the painful history of colonialism in the Pacific, but in doing so it undermines Diamond's ultimate goal of getting people to take climate change seriously. Narratives clearly have power, which is why I presume Diamond wanted to use Rapa Nui as an allegory. But in pointing out that the allegory is not supported by the best research, we should not then conclude that many decades' worth of climate science is also untrustworthy. Now, as longtime listeners know, I have many thoughts on Jared Diamond. After these episodes came out, many listeners asked me to give my thoughts on his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. So that's exactly what I did in episodes 136 and 137 of this podcast. Those shows are a deep dive into Diamond's grand historical theory about why it was Europeans who colonized North America and not indigenous North Americans who colonized Europe. Season 6 of this podcast ended up being bookended by Jared Diamond. We started with Rapa Nui and his book Collapse, and we ended with Guns, Germs, and Steel. So if you're curious about that, look back through your feed and find episodes 136 and 137. In the end, I was very happy with how this series concluded. In fact, it may be one of my better conclusions. So I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, here is episode number 117, What Went Down on Easter Island, Part 2. What do you think is the best way to pick a leader? It's a question that has bedeviled humanity since the beginning. Where should power reside? Should it be shared? Or should it be concentrated? In many societies, elders were considered the most wise, and therefore they either ruled or they chose who would rule. In Iroquois society, councils of clan mothers or powerful matriarchs nominated, installed, and removed chiefs. While Tibet was still an independent kingdom, the Dalai Lama, who was both a spiritual leader and a worldly king, was located by a group of monks specifically trained for the task. The monks had to find the reincarnated spirit of the former Dalai Lama in a child, and to that end they had to conduct all sorts of tests. The College of Cardinals famously votes on one of their cardinal brothers to become the new pope once the old pope passes away, or tucks into a comfy retirement. But the people of Rapa Nui may have had one of the most wonderfully unique systems of picking a leader that I have ever encountered. What I'm referring to is the event that was one part spiritual ritual and one part athletic contest that sometimes gets called the Birdman competition. At one point in Rapa Nui's history, exactly when is highly debated, but at one point, the people of Rapa Nui started worshipping a god called Makemake, or sometimes called Rongo. Makemake was depicted in art and stone carvings as a giant bird. He's sometimes associated with the frigate, but the bird that seemed to be the most sacred to Makemake was the sooty tern, a bird the Rapa Nui people called Manutara. The Manutara are migratory birds who appear in Rapa Nui every spring. They particularly liked two small islets off the south coast of the island where they would build their nests and lay their eggs. The indigenous Rapa Nui scholar Christian Moreno Pacarati has explained the significance of the arrival of the sooty tern like this, Quote, "With its arrival around the spring equinox, the message of the Manutara was perfectly clear. The end of winter, the end of cold, the end of scarcity, the beginning of abundance, of fertility, of good times. This is the new beginning of the annual cycle and a sign from the spirit of the ancestors to renew their alliance with the living." End quote. This spirit of renewal also seems to have extended to the island's politics. Every year when the sooty turns arrived, an island-wide competition was held. The winner of this competition would be hailed as the new Tangata Manu, or Birdman, for the year. This was a sacred position, as the Birdman was considered the god Maki Maki in human form. The Birdman would spend his year-long tenure in a ritual house where he was waited on hand and foot. He wore only the ritual costume of the Birdman, including a headdress made of human hair. He never trimmed his fingernails, instead letting them grow into bird-like talons. But most importantly, the clan that the Birdman hailed from enjoyed an elite status on the island during that year. They were given special privileges when it came to the administration of the island's resources, including the collection of birds' eggs. In other words, it was a good thing to have a Birdman in the family. So every year around the spring equinox, each of the island's clans would send 2 strong men known as Hopu to represent their interests in the Birdman competition. The competition would begin with the Hopu swimming 3 kilometers from the coast of the main island to the tiny islets of Motu Nui and Motu Iti. This swim was complicated by the fact that this 3-kilometer gap was a notorious haunt for hungry sharks. So if the Hopu survived the sharks, then they would have to camp out on that island for as long as it took to find the first sooty tern egg of the season. Sometimes this could take days, even weeks. When a Hopu finally found an egg, he would then run to the highest point on Motu Nui and yell to shore. He would scream out the name of his clan leader and follow it with the command, "Go shave your head! You have got the egg!" The call would be taken up by observers on shore, and people would relay the message all the way to the appropriate clan leader. The clan leader would then ritually shave his head, paint his face, and proceed to the village of Orongo, where he would await the arrival of his Hopu. But things weren't over yet. The Hopu still had to get to Orongo with the egg intact. To do that, the competitor would have to safely place his egg in a specially designed reed pouch that would be strapped to his forehead. He would then need to swim back across the shark-infested waters until he came to the steep sea cliffs that stood between him and Orongo. Now, I'm going to post some pictures of this place on the Facebook page and on the page for this episode at ourfakehistory.com so you can really get a sense of this. But when you look back to shore from the islets of Motu Nui and Motu Iti, these sea cliffs look pretty imposing. A successful Hopu would need to climb those cliffs without falling to his death or breaking the sacred egg. If either of those things should happen, the competition would continue, and another Hopu would have a chance to make their clan leader the Birdman. When a Hopu finally made it to the top of the cliff, he would then run to the sacred village of Orongo, where he would present the egg to his clan leader, who by this time would be waiting patiently, fasting in his ritual regalia. Upon accepting the egg, the clan leader would become that year's Tangata Manu, or Birdman. The whole of Rapa Nui would be expected to accept his sacred status and privileges given to his clan until the sooty terns returned again the next year. I think it goes without saying that the Birdman competition is supremely badass. I can't really think of any other culture where political and religious status was so directly linked to an athletic competition. It's just so cool. But the history of the Birdman competition, like everything else on Rapa Nui, is deeply controversial. Experts disagree about when this particular tradition took root on the island. Some, like geographer Jared Diamond and linguist Stephen Fisher, have argued that the worship of Makemake and the attendant Birdman ritual evolved as the result of the island's ecological collapse. The theory goes that sometime in the mid-1600s, the islanders completely deforested their island home. This set off a chain reaction of environmental catastrophes, including extreme soil erosion, which would have led to famine and depopulation. After generations of warfare stemming from this ecological collapse, the Birdman competition evolved as a means to equitably and peacefully manage the island's increasingly scarce resources. Or, at least, so goes the theory. This hypothesis also gets paired with another theory about the evolution of the islanders' religion. That being that the ecological collapse led to a disillusionment with the island's traditional system of ancestor worship, the greatest expression of which were the colossal stone Moai statues. When the ancestors failed to protect the island from famine and strife, the Moai were abandoned and eventually toppled and defaced. From then on, the religious needs of the islanders were met by Makemake and the Birdman cult. But in recent years, many scholars have started to challenge this assessment of Rapa Nui's history. Many experts, including a growing number of indigenous scholars from Rapa Nui, believe that the Birdman cult existed alongside the traditional worship of the ancestors and the Moai. The toppling of the Moai may not have started until Europeans made contact with the island. What's more, the ecological collapse of Rapa Nui may have been profoundly misunderstood and exaggerated by a number of high-profile academics. It's been taken for granted that the civilization of Rapa Nui was completely destabilized by deforestation and was sent into a steep decline in the mid-17th century. But now, many believe that there is way more to that story. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of it today on Our Fake History. Episode number 117, What Went Down on Easter Island, Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast that explores historical myths and tries to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. This week, we are returning to the island of Rapa Nui, aka Easter Island, to hopefully get a deeper understanding of the controversies that have come to characterize that island's history. But before we get to that, I just want to remind all the Dirty Church fans in the crowd that the new 4-song EP, The Last Supper EP, is now available at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. As you probably already know, Dirty Church are the band that brings us the theme song every week, and, I play guitar in the band and sing some of the songs. I'm going to be playing another selection from that EP at the end of today's show. So if you're curious about what the new songs sound like, please be sure to stick around right to the end of the show. Now, I know there's a bunch of you that like to turn the show off when it seems like I'm done telling the story, but there are treats in that final section. It's also where you can find answers to frequently asked questions like, what's your email address? I literally say it at the end of every show. But if you're not interested in all that extra information and you just want to hear that brand spanking new Dirty Church tune, then maybe just skip right to the end and give it a listen. Okay. So as you've probably already noticed, this is part 2 of a 2-part series on Rapa Nui. So if you haven't listened to part 1, you may want to go back and give that a listen now. Back in episode 1, I tried to introduce the myriad of theories out there concerning the history of Rapa Nui, an island you might know better as Easter Island. And as I said in that first episode, I'm going to be using the indigenous name for the island, Rapa Nui, as much as I can in this series. So remember, Rapa Nui equals Easter Island. For centuries, outsiders have speculated wildly about this island. Just do a quick Google search of Easter Island. Half the stuff you'll get back will be things like the mystery of Easter Island, or the puzzle of Easter Island, or mystery solved on Easter Island. Theories about the island usually revolve around 3 main topics. First, how people got there in the first place. Second, how the people of the island built their impressive stone statues known as Moai. And third, how and why the society on Easter Island apparently collapsed. In the last episode, I took some time to explore the oral traditions that the Rapa Nui people have about their arrival on the island. I also looked at Thor Heyerdahl's controversial reconstruction of the island's past, and hopefully pointed out exactly how and why he was wrong. Now, I also made a quick reference to the theories about the island that have been put forward by the likes of Graham Hancock and Eric von Daniken. As many of you know, Hancock's hypothesis about a super ancient lost civilization and von Daniken's ancient astronauts theories often come up on this podcast. Both of these thinkers have incorporated the mysteries of Rapa Nui into their respective theories on the origins of human civilization. For von Daniken, the Great Stone Moai stand as another piece of evidence that extraterrestrial visitors used advanced technology to build many of humanity's oldest architectural wonders. For Hancock, a handful of anomalous statues on the island seem to be another clue that there was once a world-spanning, megalith-building super society who left their fingerprints all over the globe. Rapa Nui is a magnet for this kind of speculation. But at the heart of every theory about the island, be it fringe or otherwise, always stand the Great Stone Moai. To be fair, for a long time, these amazing stone statues seemed to defy explanation. At least, so thought outsiders. When the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen first encountered Rapa Nui in 1722, he was completely puzzled by how these giant statues could have been erected when the island was completely bare of trees. Surely huge amounts of timber would have been needed to transport, erect, and adorn these colossi. It was assumed that the islanders would have needed scaffolding, sledges, rollers, and untold lengths of rope to get the Moai into their final position on the mighty stone platforms known as ahu. With no trees, the feat seemed impossible. And when you have impossible feats, you have a hole that is easily filled with extraterrestrials and Atlanteans, or Heyerdahl's long-eared settlers from Peru. As I hopefully demonstrated in the last episode, the more you learn about Polynesian art, religion, and culture, the clearer it becomes that the Moai were obviously created by the Rapa Nui people. They were the ultimate expression of artistic motifs and religious concepts found all over Polynesia. They were mana turned to stone. And yes, the spiritual power I spoke of last episode is pronounced more like mana and not mana, like I said last time. Sorry about that. So, hopefully I've addressed why the Moai were built. But I haven't really addressed how they were built. The answer to that question is deeply connected to the island's trees, or lack of trees. There are some who argue that it was the building of the Moai that led directly to the collapse of Rapa Nui. But is that true? Well, let's take a closer look. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Quince. August is the perfect time to hit reset before the autumn rush begins. And honestly, I can't think of a better place to start than my closet. That's why I love shopping at Quince. Quince is all about fewer, better pieces. Their clothes are made with premium materials built to last and designed to become the ones that you reach for every day. So, if you're like me, you're probably still hanging on to some worn-out basics. I have a bad habit of keeping t-shirts for like 7 million years. I still have stuff that I wore in university. It's preposterous. Anyway, Quince makes it easy to upgrade. They have premium denim and tailored chinos from just $60 with the kind of perfect fit, structure, and high-quality fabrics you'd expect from a luxury designer brand. The t-shirts that I picked up from Quince, I've been wearing all summer. They are super cozy, and I'm pretty excited to bust out my Quince jacket once the weather starts turning colder up here. It's time to upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers, or go to quince.com/fakehistory and get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK too. That's QUINCE.com/fakehistory. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. There are 887 known Moai that were produced on Rapa Nui during the main statue building period, which is usually dated between the 13th and 17th centuries. Now, the look of these statues is completely iconic, with the distinctive elongated heads, prominent noses, and long ears. All of the island statues seem to have been carved in the exact same place, and that was the island's Rano Raraku quarry. Rano Raraku is an extinct volcanic crater that's an excellent source of a particular type of volcanic rock known as tuff. Now, despite its ironic-sounding name, tuff is a relatively soft type of rock that makes it ideal for carving. Tuff could be shaped and finessed with the stone tools available to the Rapa Nui people. The moai would be carved in one giant piece directly out of the rock face. All of the adornments would be finished there in the quarry, except notably for the statue's eyes and the great headdresses, or pukao, that were perched on top of many of the moai. So if you see pictures of moai, you might notice that some of them look like they're wearing these giant, impressive hats. Well, most experts now believe that they weren't meant to represent hats at all. Instead, they were thought to be the hair of the sacred ancestor, done up in the traditional top knot style worn by the ancestral chiefs. As researcher Sean Hickson has pointed out, in Polynesian belief, mana, the spiritual power that gave the ancestors legitimacy, was thought to be connected to one's hair. If the moai represented mana, then having good hair was essential. Furthermore, many Rapa Nui have pointed out that the word for the head adornments, pukao, literally means top knot in the Rapa Nui language. And I really hope I'm pronouncing that word correctly. The internet wasn't giving me much guidance on how to say it just right. So to any Polynesian or Rapa Nui listeners out there, I'm sorry if I butchered any of your language's words today. But these final touches on the moai, the red stone pukao, the deep-set eyes, were only added to the statues once they reached their final home. The moai were placed on great stone platforms called ahu. Ahu can be found all around the island, ringing the coastline. Each of these ahu were associated with a separate family or clan group. When the moai reached the ahu from the quarry, it was then carefully balanced in place and was set to look inland. Aside from one curious set of sea-gazing moai, all the others look back towards the center of the island. The moai watched over the people and used their mana to demarcate their territory, protect the people from misfortune, and bless the fields. But interestingly, the area around the traditional quarry is home to nearly 50% of all the island's existent moai. Now, why would that be? Well, it seems like the Rapa Nui were perfectionists when it came to the production of their sacred statues. If during the carving process the statue started to crack, or if any mistakes were made, the statue would be abandoned. Today, you can still find half-carved moai protruding unfinished from the volcanic stone. The largest of these unfinished moai is nicknamed El Gigante, which, had it been completed, would have stood 65 feet tall. But also, all around the Rano Raraku site, there are dozens of other statues that seem to have been abandoned because they were damaged during the transportation process. Around half of the moai never made it more than 2 kilometers away from the quarry. If a moai was damaged in any way, it was left where it laid. Now, ironically, it's these abandoned moai that have gone on to be some of the island's most iconic statues. You see, at one point in the island's history, moai all around the island were toppled and defaced, the reasons for which we'll get into a little later. But these abandoned moai near the quarry were left alone, as presumably they weren't seen as important. These moai weren't connected to any clan, and they weren't the centers of religious focus, so they weren't defaced. Then, years later, they went on to be photographed as the iconic stone heads of Easter Island. However, a very recent study from 2019 suggests that some of the standing moai near Rano Raraku may not have just been abandoned. Some of them may have been placed there purposefully to ensure the sacredness of that site. As head researcher Joanne von Tilburg has pointed out, quote, "Our excavation broadens our perspective of the Moai and encourages us to realize that nothing, no matter how obvious, is ever exactly as it seems." End quote. Amen to that. That's a refrain we'll be coming back to a lot in this episode. Nothing, no matter how obvious, is ever exactly as it seems. But the point is that the transportation process was incredibly challenging, and it wasn't uncommon for Moai to not survive the journey from the quarry to the Ahu. But the question still remains, how did they do it? How did they move these multi-ton behemoths? Well, for most of the 20th century, it was assumed that the people of Rapa Nui had to have used timber of some sort to transport the statues. In the 1950s, our old buddy Thor Heyerdahl proposed that the statues were moved much in the same way that the Rapa Nui Islanders moved small rocks at that time. He believed the statues were laid down on their backs and placed on wooden sledges. They were then pulled to their location along a lubricated path. In the 1970s, the anthropologist William Malloy tweaked Heyerdahl's theory by proposing that the wood sledge was probably dragged with the aid of a large wooden device that he thought looked like an inverted letter V. It kind of worked like an elaborate lever that could provide some extra force to move the incredibly heavy statues. It should be noted that both of these models proved extremely awkward and very slow when tested. In 1987, the researcher Charles Love proposed that the Moai were transported on wooden sledges only standing upright. Furthermore, he suggested that the sledge would have been propelled over tree trunks, acting as giant rollers. Now, of all of the theories tried up to that point, Love's seemed to be the most effective when it came to moving giant replicas of the Moai. So for a while, Love's theory was the dominant theory when it came to Moai transportation. This theory was lent further credence by Joanne von Tilburg, the expert I just mentioned, who conducted a successful experiment in the early 2000s using a wooden sledge and rollers. However, she tweaked Love's theory by once again laying the Moai down on its back as opposed to transporting it standing up. But I know what you're thinking. Hey, Sebastian, I thought you said that Rapa Nui had no trees. This process seems kind of lumber intensive. And yeah, you would be right. It's fair to ask if Charles Love and Joanne von Tilburg are right about the transportation of the Moai, then where were the Rapa Nui getting all this wood? Well, this is where the groundbreaking research of John Flenley and Sarah King comes in. These two researchers conducted an exhaustive study into pollen deposits found on the island. Through the analysis of this pollen, they were able to prove that Rapa Nui had not always been a grassy, treeless island. On the contrary, at one point it had been mostly covered by a dense subtropical forest. What's more, the common tree in the forest was the world's largest species of palm tree. This palm would have been closely related to the Chilean wine palm, which can grow over 80 feet tall and has a 6-foot diameter. When the Rapa Nui people first arrived on the remote island, they would have encountered a dense and verdant forest. In other words, for about 500 years, the people of Rapa Nui had access to lots of wood. The existence of porpoise skeletons in early Rapa Nui settlements have also led to speculation that the people of the island were using their trees to build large, seaworthy boats that were used for deep-sea fishing. However, Flenley and King's study also determined that starting around the year 800, the forest steadily started to disappear. The pollen record shows that the once dense Rapa Nui forest steadily shrank over the centuries until by the mid-1600s it had entirely disappeared. In the 1990s, as this study became more widely known, it seemed to answer a number of key questions about Rapa Nui. The Moai could have been transported using elaborate wooden rollers because the island had once been covered by trees. But it was only a matter of time before someone connected the final dot. If Charles Love's theory about Moai construction involving untold quantities of wood was correct, and the pollen record showed the disappearance of the forest, perhaps the construction of the Moai led to the death of the forest. Furthermore, the ecological catastrophe that was assumed to have accompanied the loss of the forest surely would have led to internal strife, warfare, and a disillusionment with the Moai themselves. This may have even led to the toppling of the Moai and the rise of the Birdman cult. Perhaps this was the key to Rapa Nui's so-called collapse. This theory was very persuasive, no less so because one of its biggest cheerleaders was one of the world's most read geographers, Jared Diamond. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, let's see how Jared Diamond completely reshaped the conversation around Rapa Nui. Jared Diamond may be the world's best-known popular science writer. He works as a geography professor at UCLA, but he's better known as the author of books like Guns, Germs, and Steel that bring in research from a variety of fields in order to answer huge questions about the outcomes in human history. Published in 1997, Guns, Germs, and Steel asked why it was Europeans who turned up in the Americas and conquered the indigenous civilizations, and not the other way around. Why didn't boats filled with Mayans or Mexica people turn up in Spain in the 1400s and topple that society? In the book, he proposes a hypothesis that the geography of the Eurasian landmass offered a couple of key advantages in terms of easily domesticated plants and animals that meant that when Europeans and indigenous Americans met, Europeans had a couple of important technological and biological weapons, namely guns, germs, and steel. It's kind of an interesting theory in its own right, but it's also super controversial. So it's probably worth exploring in detail on this podcast one day down the road. So put a pin in that. But all we need to know right now is that Guns, Germs, and Steel was a huge hit. It was an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, and it even won the Pulitzer Prize. From that point on, Jared Diamond has been a public intellectual that a lot of people take very seriously. So, in 2005, when he published the book Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, many took note. In that book, Diamond explored how various societies had brought about their own collapse due to the mismanagement of their natural resources. In Collapse, the very first example of this phenomena he cites is the case of Rapa Nui. His chapter on Rapa Nui, called Twilight at Easter, was essentially an expanded version of an article he had written a decade earlier called Adaptive Failure: Easter's End. In that article, and then again in his book, Diamond made the case that Rapa Nui Islanders brought about their own collapse. In his estimation, the quest for bigger and better Moai created a competitive atmosphere that trumped any calls for the stewardship of the island's resources. He describes it like this, quote, "With the passing years, the statues and platforms became larger and larger, and the statues began supporting 10-ton red crowns, probably in an escalating spiral of one-upmanship as rival clans tried to surpass each other with shows of wealth and power. In the same way, successive Egyptian pharaohs built ever larger pyramids. Today, Hollywood movie moguls near my home in Los Angeles are displaying their wealth and power by building ever more ostentatious mansions. Tycoon Marvin Davis topped previous moguls with plans for a 50,000 square foot house, and now Aaron Spelling has topped Davis with a 56,000 square foot house. All that those buildings lack to make the message explicit are 10-ton red crowns. On Easter, as in modern America, society was held together by a complex political system to redistribute locally available resources and to integrate the economies of different areas. Eventually, Easter's growing population was cutting the forest more rapidly than the forest was regenerating. The people used the land for gardens and wood for fuel, canoes and houses, and of course, for lugging statues. As forest disappeared, the islanders ran out of timber and rope to transport and erect their statues. Life became more uncomfortable, springs and streams dried up, and wood was no longer available for fires." End quote. That was a long one. But as you can see from that passage, Jared Diamond saw in Easter Island a cautionary tale about hubris and misplaced priorities. Now, to be fair, in his book, Collapse, Diamond is careful to outline the important religious significance of the Moai, but he also can't resist portraying them as the ultimate status symbol. As you can imagine, most indigenous Polynesians didn't particularly appreciate their sacred heritage being compared to Aaron Spelling's Hollywood mansion. Jared Diamond argued that the deforestation of Rapa Nui led to a swift decline in the island's population, a period of interclan warfare, a brutal famine, and ultimately cannibalism. In other words, when the clearing of the forest was complete in the mid-1600s, the collapse of Rapa Nui followed close behind. The people met by Jacob Rakavin in 1722 were but the remnants of what had once been a thriving society. Diamond also explicitly argued that the history of Rapa Nui could be read as a metaphor for our own environmentally troubled times. Our priorities are wrong. We are degrading our environment, and as such, we could be headed for collapse. He writes, quote, "As we try to imagine the decline of Easter's civilization, we ask ourselves, why didn't they look around, realize what they were doing, and stop before it was too late? What were they thinking when they cut down the last palm tree? I suspect, though, that the disaster happened not with a bang, but with a whimper. After all, there are those hundreds of abandoned statues to consider. The forest the islanders depended on for rollers and rope didn't simply disappear one day. It vanished slowly, over decades. Perhaps war interrupted the moving teams. Perhaps by the time the carvers had finished their work, the last rope snapped. In the meantime, any islander who tried to warn about the dangers of progressive deforestation would have been overridden by vested interests of carvers, bureaucrats, and chiefs whose jobs depended on continued deforestation. Our Pacific Northwest loggers are only the latest in a long line of loggers to cry, 'Jobs over trees.'" End quote. Diamond's vision of pre-collapse Rapa Nui is downright haunting. He speculates that the destruction of the island's forest was steadily pushed by powerful islanders who easily parallel the moneyed interests of our own society. If he hadn't made his point clear enough, Diamond closes his article by putting a very fine point on it. He writes, quote, "By now, the meaning of Easter Island for us should be chillingly obvious. Easter Island is Earth writ small. Today, again, a rising population confronts shrinking resources." End quote. Now, a few weeks back, I had a conversation with Mark Chrysler, host of the podcast The Constant, A History of Getting Things Wrong. We recorded our chat and we put it out for our respective Patreon supporters. In the course of that conversation, at one point, Mark asked me if I had a healthy fear of narrative. What he was getting at was how powerful and attractive a good story can be. How really good stories can get us to accept things without question. I knew exactly what he was talking about, because parsing those attractive historical stories is what this podcast is all about. And yeah, I had to admit, the power of narrative can be kind of freaky. Well, Jared Diamond's take on Rapa Nui ended up being massively influential. People ate it up, mostly because it was such a good story. It seemed to tie up so many loose ends. It was also particularly attractive to those advocating for environmental reforms. Here was a nice, contained example of the dire consequences of unsustainable environmental exploitation. Heed the lesson of Easter Island or be forced to repeat it. The allegory of it all was just too delicious. But just because it's a good story doesn't mean it's right. You see, Jared Diamond's take on Rapa Nui continues to be repeated, often by well-meaning people advocating for worthy causes. But despite that, it hasn't really aged well. In fact, Jared Diamond may have been completely and utterly wrong about Rapa Nui, and he may have unwittingly contributed to the erasure of Rapa Nui's dark experience with colonialism. So, what's the problem with Diamond's take? Well, to answer that question, I need to introduce you to yet another set of researchers. Yeah, I know, there's lots of researchers, but that's the kind of episode we're doing. Allow me to introduce you to Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo. Hunt and Lipo are two professors who started doing work on Rapa Nui in the early 2000s. When they started their anthropological investigations, they weren't really trying to overturn the consensus that Easter Island was, quote, the clearest example of a society that destroyed itself, end quote. But after a decade's worth of research, Hunt and Lipo started publishing work that directly challenged a number of widely held ideas about the island. Namely, that the islanders were entirely to blame for the deforestation of Rapa Nui, that this deforestation was sped up by the construction of the Moai, and finally, that the deforestation led to a population crash, warfare, and even cannibalism. So, let's break this down. First, there's the question of how and why Rapa Nui lost its forest. Jared Diamond lays the lion's share of the blame at the feet of the Rapa Nui people and their obsession with bigger and better statues. Now, to be clear, no one is arguing that the forests of Rapa Nui didn't disappear, Hunt and Lipo included. The pollen record is very clear, and honestly, just look at the island today. However, the deforestation may not have entirely been the fault of the islanders. One of the other main culprits was an invasive species, the Polynesian rat. The rat would have been introduced to the island along with the first human settlers. The original voyaging canoes probably contained a few of these Polynesian rats that were sometimes used as an emergency source of protein. Once on the island, the rats' population would have exploded thanks to a steady source of food, namely the palm nuts from the now extinct Easter Island palm. By eating the palm nuts, the rats may have kept cleared sections of forest from regenerating and even may have hurt healthy sections of forest. Now, to be fair, Diamond does acknowledge the potential role of the Polynesian rat in the deforestation. But there's more. Climate change may have also played a role. Starting around the year 1300, the planet went through a period of global cooling, sometimes called the Little Ice Age. For Rapa Nui, this would have meant that their once warm and wet island would have become considerably drier and colder. This would have hurt the health of the forest and may have kept cleared sections from regenerating. Interestingly, the Little Ice Age has also been cited by Polynesian experts like Christian Pakarati as the reason that long-distance ocean voyaging also declined at that time. Colder temperatures would have affected ocean currents, which would have meant that formerly reliable ocean routes may have become erratic and dangerous. Small islands that formerly sustained settlements may have become uninhabitable. This would have meant that there were fewer places for voyagers to stop for resupply. The theory goes that this disrupted what would have been active ocean trade routes that extended from Rapa Nui to Hawaii all the way to New Zealand. This would have further isolated the already far-flung island of Rapa Nui. So when you consider the impacts of climate change and the Polynesian rat, the fate of Rapa Nui's forest seems less like a man-made ecocide. But don't get me wrong. The people of the island certainly were clearing trees. They were using lumber to build their homes and build sturdy deep water fishing boats. They were also clearing land for their farms, where they cultivated taro, chickens, and sweet potato. But were they rapaciously cutting down trees in the quest to build bigger and better Moai? Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo say no. You see, the people of Rapa Nui had long held oral traditions that the Moai walked to their positions on the ceremonial ahu. In fact, in one sacred story, the god Makemake himself commanded the Moai to walk to their places on the island. For years, non-indigenous researchers either ignored these traditions or wrote them off as fanciful mythology. Interestingly, the first researcher to really take these traditions seriously was our old buddy Thor Heyerdahl. In the 1980s, he returned to Rapa Nui and revised his theory on the transportation of the Moai. In 1986, Heyerdahl experimented with moving a replica Moai in a standing position. He used ropes to move the Moai in a twisting fashion that kind of looked like it was walking. But the experiment didn't get far before the Moai was damaged, and as a result, the walking Moai hypothesis never really picked up steam. That was until Hunt and Lipo revived the idea in the early 2010s. The researchers warmed to the idea that the Moai were walked into position by teams of movers using ropes, after years of observing the abandoned Moai outside of the Rano Raraku quarry. According to Hunt and Lipo, most of these abandoned statues looked like they had fallen over from a standing position, specifically those that were laying face down or on their sides. Notably, none of these Moai seem to have been abandoned on wooden sledges. And if you think about it, if you had a giant statue lying on its back on a wooden sledge, why would you abandon it at all? You can't really, fall over. Furthermore, Hunt and Lipo believed that certain design features on the statues, including the way they were shaped on the underside, were done specifically to allow the statues to walk. Hunt and Lipo believed that the statues were stood upright at the quarry. Ropes were then tied around the Moai's head, covering the eye sockets. Then 3 teams of movers would alternately haul on 3 separate ropes, one to the left, one to the right, and one extending backwards for balance. By heaving one way and then the other, the Moai could be made to take steps. It really kind of looks like the statue is walking. In 2011, Hunt and Lipo conducted an experiment with a replica Moai in Hawaii. Using their walking technique, a team of 18 unskilled people moved a 10-foot, 5-ton replica Moai 100 yards in 40 minutes. I'll post a video of this experiment on the Facebook page and at ourfakehistory.com so you can really get a sense of what's going on here. If you're having a hard time visualizing exactly how this heave-ho method works, the video will fill in some blanks. The experiment demonstrated that this particular method of transportation could have worked, and even more significantly, it didn't require much lumber at all. If this technique was in fact what was used, then all the islanders would have needed was some strong rope, which meant that Moai construction probably wasn't putting a big strain on the forest. Now, it should be noted that Hunt and Lipo's hypothesis on the transportation of the Moai is not universally accepted. The archaeologist Joanne van Tilburg, who I've mentioned a couple times now, has been especially critical of Hunt and Lipo's work. In 2011, she had this to say about the walking Moai experiment. Quote, "What they did was a stunt, not an experiment." End quote. She was not convinced that their model Moai properly approximated the real Moai on Rapa Nui, and as such, she found their findings to be unscientific. But despite Van Tilburg's initial criticisms, Hunt and Lipo's conclusions have been embraced by a growing number of experts. The indigenous archaeologist and the island's former governor, Sergio Rapu Ho'ao, has been particularly vocal in his support of the theory. Having one of the island's best-known indigenous experts on board has certainly led the hypothesis quite a bit of credibility. The point is that if Hunt and Lipo are right, and many people think they are, then the disappearance of Rapa Nui's forest probably had nothing to do with the construction of the Moai. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Shopify. When I first started this podcast in 2015, I had a lot of people tell me that it wasn't a good idea. Believe it or not, even in 2015, there were people who thought that podcasts were already washed and I was making a huge mistake trying to start one up. Well, they were wrong. It's easy to get discouraged when starting a new business, but I'm telling you, it's worth it. If you've been sitting on a business idea, Shopify makes it easy to make it happen. Everything you need to start selling is included and ready from day one. All Shopify storefronts are integrated with a checkout, also called Shop Pay for free. Shop Pay is a one-click checkout, which makes it super easy for people to buy your stuff. Because Shopify handles the setup and checkout, you have more time to focus on growing your business. Shopify powers millions of businesses worldwide, from household names to small businesses just getting started. All you need is the idea. Shopify handles the rest. If you're serious about hearing your first, then you're ready for Shopify. Start your free trial at shopify.com/fake today. You heard that right. Start your free trial today at shopify.com/fake. That's shopify.com/fake. While it looks considerably less likely that the destruction of Rapa Nui's forest was sped by human hubris, thanks to a combination of mostly natural factors, by the mid-1600s, the forest was still gone. But did this lead to Rapa Nui's collapse? Well, Hunt and Lipo once again say no. Instead, they argue that the Rapa Nui people actually managed to create a surprisingly sustainable society on their deforested island. The traditional assumption was that the loss of the trees would have led to soil erosion and a depletion of the island's nutrients. However, Hunt and Lipo have pointed out that the people of Rapa Nui developed clever agricultural practices that kept their island surprisingly fertile, despite the lack of trees. One of these techniques was the practice of tilling the land with volcanic stones. This is called lithic mulch, and I'm not sure if that's a good name for a band or not. Lithic mulch. Still, sounds cool. Either way, this technique is used around the world to bring minerals back to vulnerable soils. Then there's the question of population decline. Citing the work of earlier experts, Jared Diamond believed that the island would have at one time sustained a population of 10 to 15,000 people. Then it crashed to around 2,000 people in the mid-17th century, presumably after the loss of the forest. But Hunt and Lipo have argued that there's very little evidence that the population on the island was ever much bigger than 3,000 or 4,000 people. There also doesn't seem to be any archaeological evidence of mass death in the mid-1600s. There would be material evidence of that kind of catastrophe, overflowing burial grounds or cremation pits, and that's just not the case on Rapa Nui. One piece of evidence that often gets cited in support of the idea that a famine swept the island in the mid-1600s are a group of indigenous wood carvings called Moai Kava Kava, or Moai with ribs. These are small wooden figures that seem to depict emaciated, starving people. Jared Diamond has speculated that these were created to commemorate the famine he assumes swept the island in the mid-1600s. But this is a bit of a stretch, as experts think that they may have been used for all sorts of ritual purposes. It's also important to note that these statues have not been conclusively dated, and it's just as likely that they were produced in a later period, which I will speak about in a moment. Hunt and Lipo have also challenged the idea that warfare erupted on the island after the loss of the trees. The main piece of evidence for a period of warfare in the mid-1600s are a series of obsidian artifacts that have been found scattered around the island. These artifacts are known as mata'a. These were traditionally assumed to be spear points and other forms of weaponry. However, in 2016, Hunt and Lipo published their own study on the mata'a, where they argued that these pieces of obsidian probably weren't weapons at all. These obsidian pieces were found in many different shapes, most of which were particularly bad for stabbing or piercing skin. As such, Hunt and Lipo believe that they were probably farming implements and domestic tools. In fact, the archaeological record on Rapa Nui tells the tale of an especially peaceful society. Before contact with Europeans, weaponry appears rarely in the archaeological record. The island also doesn't seem to have any fortified places or defensive structures pre-contact. On top of that, an analysis of pre-contact skeletons shows that only an extremely small number are what are called traumatized skeletons. That is, skeletons that show evidence of a violent death. That suggests that before contact with Europeans, relatively few people died violently, which means there probably wasn't any large-scale warfare until after 1722, some 70 years after the supposed collapse was supposed to take place. Now, this brings us full circle, back to the primary sources I used to open part 1 of this series. Those were the journals of the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen and his officers. When reading those journals, you need to ask yourself, did Roggeveen really encounter a collapsed society? Well, I have read those journals, and I'm going to go with a hard no. On the contrary, Roggeveen describes a healthy population of roughly 3,000 people on the island in 1722. He describes a functioning system of government with a clear head chief, an aristocratic class, and priests. The wealthy and ritually important folk on the island seem to be well dressed in colorful cloth and adorned with all sorts of jewelry. All the Moai appear to be standing, and the religion associated with them appears to be in full swing. Roggeveen specifically mentions seeing ritual fires lit before the Moai, and islanders performing songs and other rituals in front of them. What's more, the island seemed to be fertile, and the islanders seemed to have an abundance of food. During one of his trading sessions, Roggeveen wrote that the islanders, quote, brought a great abundance of sugarcane, fowls, yams, and bananas, end quote. The Dutch captain was actually given more food than he even needed, and actually chose to turn some of it away. Roggeveen's officer, Sergeant Major Carl Behrens, said this about the Rapa Nui farms, quote, the fields, or lands, were all measured off with a cord and very neatly cultivated. At the time of our visit, all their crops were maturing. The fields and trees were in full bearing, and I feel sure that if we had explored this country right through, many good things would have been met with, since we were there in just the best season of the year. End quote. In the official minutes from the meeting of Roggeveen's commanders, it was recorded that, quote, we found the island exceedingly fruitful, producing bananas, potatoes, sugarcane of remarkable thickness, and many other kinds of fruits of the earth. Although destitute of large trees and domestic animals, except poultry, this place, as far as its rich soil and good climate are concerned, is such that it might be made into an earthly paradise. End quote. Yeah, that's right. An earthly paradise. If this is a collapsed society, then that term is completely meaningless. All of the observations made by Roggeveen and his crew seem to suggest that the people of Rapa Nui had learned how to live sustainably on their island. The traditional forms of government and religion all seem to be functioning without much of a problem. Furthermore, Behrens noted that he didn't see any weaponry amongst the people on the island. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't any weapons, but it does seem to suggest that the people of Rapa Nui weren't particularly warlike. Altogether, nothing about these observations suggest that Rapa Nui had just lived through decades of famine and inter-island conflict. As you might remember from the last episode, Thor Heyerdahl was so taken by Roggeveen's idyllic description that he could barely believe that the Dutch commander was describing the island that Heyerdahl had come to know in the 1950s. This decidedly uncollapsed description of Rapa Nui is what inspired Heyerdahl to concoct his elaborate theory about the long-eared South American settlers. So in 1722, I'm going to say Rapa Nui had not collapsed. But something does seem to have changed on the island by 1774, when Captain Cook made his way to Rapa Nui. Cook and his crew did not find an earthly paradise. They found a society that had very clearly been disrupted and had lived through a period of serious conflict. Cook's botanist described land that clearly had been cultivated at one time, but now had been abandoned. Most strikingly, a number of the island's Moai had been thrown down and defaced. So based on the primary sources, it seems like the real period of unrest came after contact with Europeans, and quite possibly because of contact with Europeans. The visit from the Dutch in 1722, or possibly a later visit from the Spanish in 1770, could very well have introduced infectious disease to the island. This could account for the decline in population noticed in the 50 years between Roggeveen and Cook's visits. The toppled Moai in this period also suggest inter-island conflict. Death from disease, and possibly the world-shaking experience of watching people murdered by Dutch muskets, may have led to a questioning of the traditional order on the island. This could have led to a disillusionment with the traditional religion, the old leaders, or both. Seeing as each of the Moai were associated with a specific clan, toppling a statue may have been done as an attack on a specific family unit or clan group. It's entirely possible that it was in this period, in the mid-1700s, not the mid-1600s, when the islanders carved the emaciated Moai Kava Kava. Based on the primary sources, this was the dark time, and could very well have been a time of disease. Christian Paccarati has suggested that contact with Europeans also deeply affected the rise of the Birdman cult. While he maintains that worship of the ancestors and the Moai never truly ended on Rapa Nui, he's also said that, quote, its apogee was after the arrival of the first Europeans, when the Tangata Manu, Birdman competition at Orongo, reached its maximum expression. It's altogether possible that the arrival of these European ships simply confirmed to the islanders the truth behind their religious beliefs, transforming it into a type of cargo cult, end quote. In other words, the encounter with Europeans changed the way the islanders saw themselves in relation to the rest of the world, and this changed everything. If there was a collapse, this was the collapse. The 19th century wouldn't be any kinder to Rapa Nui. As word of the island's unique heritage spread, European ships started turning up specifically to loot the island of its Moai. To this day, a large Moai stands in the British Museum that was unceremoniously scooped up by the HMS Topaz in 1868. When the crew took the statue, it was among one of the last standing Moai on the island. It looked over the village of Orongo, the village sacred to the Birdman. Now, the fact that it was there at all really does suggest that the worship of the Moai and the Birdman cult existed simultaneously. But this clearly mattered little to the crew of the Topaz. The Moai's name is Hoa Hakananaia, a name that is often translated as stolen friend. The 1860s were bad for Rapa Nui in general. Missionary activity on the island led to the near erasure of the indigenous culture. The last standing Moai were toppled in those years. The Birdman competition was banned, and all the objects containing the island's wonderfully unique Rongo script were collected by the Catholic missionaries and burned. Now, I could do a whole podcast on Rongo script. It's kind of incredible. It's one of the few instances in human history that we know of where a completely original script was developed. Most languages just adopt an existing script for their language, but Rongo is a complete original. Today, only a handful of objects inscribed with Rongo have survived, and thanks to the devastation wrought in the 1860s, the meaning of the characters has been lost. To this day, no one has been able to successfully decipher the script. In December of 1862, crews of Peruvian slavers started raiding the island for people to work in the guano mines back on the South American mainland. Violent abductions went on for months as hundreds of Rapa Nui people were forced into slavery. Thankfully, an international outcry over these raids eventually led to the release of the surviving victims. But in yet another dark twist, many of the people who returned from the mainland infected their countrymen with smallpox and tuberculosis. The ensuing epidemic caused a real population collapse. By the end of the 19th century, there were only a few hundred Rapa Nui people still living on the island. In 1888, the nation of Chile formally annexed the island. All of the indigenous Rapa Nui people were forced to live in the town of Hangaroa, and the rest of the island was transformed into ranch land for sheep, controlled by off-island interests. That's the way it would stay until the 1960s. So, there was a disaster on Rapa Nui, but it didn't happen when the forest disappeared in the mid-1600s. The islanders adapted to that situation and even thrived despite the loss of this important natural resource. Now, the real disaster began on Easter Sunday, 1722, when Rapa Nui became Easter Island. The disaster started when a dozen islanders were murdered with weapons that a day before would have been inconceivable. This moment, paired with the European diseases that surely accompanied the visit, this is what sent Rapa Nui into decline. But even then, even with the warfare and the statue toppling, the people of Rapa Nui continued to adapt and reimagine their society, evidenced by the rise of the Birdman competition. But as the decades wore on, so too did the travesties wrought by outsiders. Once Rapa Nui became Easter Island on European maps, it marked it for plunder, forcible conversion, and annexation. Now, imagine telling that people, a people that experienced the worst of colonialism, a people whose experience with outsiders started with murder, progressed to violent abductions, and then settled into a century-long system of segregation that outlawed them from their own island. Imagine telling them, you are the ultimate example of a society that destroyed itself. When you know the whole story, when you've learned about the research of Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, and the work of dedicated indigenous scholars like Christian Paccarati and Sergio Rapa Hoaho, then that assertion not only seems wrong, it seems downright offensive. You see, for the people of Rapa Nui, the mysteries of Easter Island were never really mysteries. They knew how they got there. They knew how they built their statues. They know what happened to them. So when the people of Rapa Nui tell us that their statues walked, maybe we should believe that the statues walked. Okay, that's all for this week. Tune in again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. Before we go this week, I need to give a very special thank you to the following people. Big ups to Josh Cornelius, to the Machinist Gardener, to Charlie Harrington, to Rebecca Grace, to Joshua Logsden, to Harry D. Richardson, to David Grant, to Martina Campoamor. I hope I said that right, Martina. Martina Campoamor. To Tim Elliott, to Greg Allen, to BRD Patriot, and to AJ Finney. Hey, I wonder if that's the AJ Finney I know. Hey, man, what's up? And finally, big ups to Teresa Yera. Your boyfriend Tim's a good dude. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. You're all beautiful human beings. It's a great time to be a patron of Our Fake History because now there are a lot of extras. I think if you are supporting at the $5 level, there are 15 or something things that you can listen to. Maybe more, actually. So if you're curious about supporting on Patreon, go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and listen to all the extra stuff. If you want more Our Fake History in your life, this is how you get it. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook. That's facebook.com/OurFakeHistory. Or just tweet at me on Twitter. I'm at OurFakeHistory. I've been really trying to catch up on my correspondences lately, so feel free to drop me a line. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com, or you can just go to dirtychurchmusic.com, where you can also see some dirty merch from the Dirty Church. Before we go today, though, I'm going to be playing a new song off the new Dirty Church Last Supper EP. The song is called Mississauga, named for the Toronto suburb, and starts with one of the best lines I think we may have ever written. I'm gonna knock your Mississauga socks off. Hope you enjoy it. As always, my name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
Mississauga socks off. Hit the road and take your fucking block off. She's gonna knock you off your feet and leave you lying in the street. You never felt the force that she's applying. You never flown half the speed she's flying. She's gonna lift you off the ground and won't think twice to put sucks off. Hit the road and take your fucking block off. She's gonna knock you off your feet and leave you lying in the street.
Hello, and welcome to Pluto Phone. If you know the name of the movie you'd like to see, just stream it for free on Pluto TV, where all your blockbuster favorites are landing all summer long. Catch Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy.
Fantastic.
The Matrix Trilogy.
Welcome to the real world.
Mean Girls.
Shut up!
Titanic.
I'm the king of the world.
And so much more. For showtimes, press nothing. They're free 24/7.
That is so fetch.
On Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.